오늘 제가 오랜만에 진짜 궁금해 분들께 추천하고 싶은 책이 있어서 카메라를 켰습니다. Stolen Focus, 도둑맞은 집중력이라는 책인데요. 한 구절 한 구절 정말 이건 나한테 필요한 얘기다 라는 생각이 들었고요. 책이 너무 좋아서 가족과 지인들한테 몇 권 선물을 했습니다. 근데 그 가족과 지인들도 야 이거 내 얘기 아니야? 라고 생각을 했대요. 우리가 21세기, 즉 인터넷과 핸드폰이 지배하는 세상에 살고 있죠. 그렇기 때문에 세계 어디에 사는 사람이든지 비슷하게 느끼는 게 있을 거예요. 특히 불안감, 산만함, 부산함 이런 것들이 삶의 질을 저하시키고 심각한 경우에는 증오로 응고가 돼서 우리가 뉴스에서 보는 수많은 폭력으로 이어지기도 한다는 것을 느끼면서 사회가 많이 불안해지고 있다 라고 생각하는 분들이 많을 것 같습니다. 이 책을 쓴 하리라는 사람도 몰입과 집중력에 관련된 과학적 전문가들을 찾아다니면서 우리 사회의 불안감과 부산함이 얼마나 심각한지, 진짜 원인은 뭔지, 어떻게 대응해야 되는지에 대한 책을 썼고요. 여러모로 수소문해서 이 작가의 개인 이메일을 알게 됐고요. 지난달에 2시간에 걸친 영상통화를 하면서 책을 쓰게 된 계기와 전달하고 싶었던 메시지에 대한 여러 가지 생각을 영상으로 담았습니다.
Well, there's something wrong with me, right? I don't have enough willpower. I'm not strong enough. The kind of messages you're getting from the people who shout at you on YouTube, you know, just pull yourself together. Pull yourself together, I kept saying to myself. And actually, it was an experience with a young person that I really loved that really forced me to begin to investigate this. I've got a godson, and when he was 9, he developed a brief and very cute obsession with Elvis Presley. And every night when he would get me to tuck him into bed, he got me to tell him the story of Elvis's life over and over again. And one night I mentioned Graceland, where Elvis lived. And I said, you know, people go and visit it. And his whole face lit up. And he said, well, Johan, will you take me to Graceland? And I said, sure, the way you do with 9-year-olds. And he said, no, do you really swear one day you'll take me to Graceland? And I said, I absolutely promise. And I didn't think of that moment again for 10 years until so many things had gone wrong. By the time he was 19, he spent literally almost all his waking hours alternating between his iPhone, his iPad, and his laptop. And his life was just this blur of WhatsApp, YouTube, porn. And it really felt like he was almost like moving at the speed of Snapchat. I wasn't that much better, right? I wasn't quite as bad, but I was staring at my own devices. And I thought, God, this is no way to live. And I suddenly remembered this moment all these years before. And I said to him, hey, let's go to Graceland. This is no way to live. Let's break this numbing routine. Let's go on a road trip all over the South. But you've got to promise me one thing, which is that if we go, you'll leave your phone in the hotel during the day because there's no point in going if you're just going to stare at your phone the whole time. And he took a while and he really thought about it because he wasn't happy living like this. And he said, you know what? Let's do it. And I think it was 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks later, we took off to New Orleans where we went first. And a couple of weeks later, we got to the gates of Graceland, right? There was no person to show you around anymore. What happens is you arrive, they hand you an iPad, you put in earbuds and the iPad shows you around, right? It says go left, go right. I'm sort of noticing as we're walking around, people just walk around Graceland staring at the iPad, right? And it's this slightly odd, I'm kind of looking at them and thinking, wow, we traveled a long way to get here, but no one's looking at it.
And you told your godson that he shouldn't be looking at the screen, but looking at the screen is part of the tour program.
Exactly. It's like the world is constantly pushing you to be staring at screens. And every now and then someone would look away from their screen and I would smile and try to make eye contact with them and I'd realize they looked away from the iPad to take out their iPhone, take a selfie, put the phone back, go back to looking at the screen. I turned to my godson to laugh about it. He was standing in the corner staring at Snapchat because from the moment we landed, he literally could not stop. And I went up to him, grabbed the phone out of his hands, but he's stronger than me. And I said, look, I know you're afraid of missing out, but this is guaranteeing that you'll miss out. You're not present in your own life. You're not showing up at the events of your own existence. This is no way to live. And he stormed off, understandably. And I found him that night by the Heartbreak Hotel where we were staying up the street. And he was sitting by the huge guitar-shaped swimming pool. And I went up to him and I apologized for getting so angry. And he didn't look up from his phone, but he said, I know something's really wrong and I don't know what it is. We came to get away from that problem of distraction, but there was nowhere to escape to because it is the air we breathe. It's everywhere. And that's when I thought, okay, I need to get to the bottom of what's happened to us and most importantly, how do we put it right?
이 책에 보면은 작가가 자기 갓선의 경험을 한 다음에 굉장히 파격적인 디지털 디톡스를 시도합니다. 통화밖에 안 되는 핸드폰, 그리고 인터넷 접속이 안 되는 컴퓨터를 가지고 미국 케이프코드라는 시골에 가서 2달을 살기로 결심을 해요. 인터넷을 쓰지 않았던 시대의 정신 상태와 감각, 집중력이 돌아오는 것을 느낀 얘기를 하면서 얼마나 우리 주변에 많은 것들이 우리의 집중력을 흐트러뜨리고 있는지를 깨달았다는 얘기를 합니다.
There's actually scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of the factors that can make it worse have been hugely rising in recent years. So when you feel the way you did, when I feel the way I did, it's the sudden realization, oh, there's nothing wrong with you. And there's nothing wrong with me. There's something wrong with the way we're living.
특히 산만한 것이 왜 사회적인 문제인지에 대해서 이야기를 하는 부분이 리프레싱 했는데, 일단 우리가 산만하면은 효율성이 떨어진다. 멀티태스킹은 효율적이지 않다라는 얘기를 합니다.
So I went to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to interview one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, an amazing man named Professor Earl Miller. And he said to me, look, there's one thing you have to understand about the human brain more than anything else. You can only consciously think about one or two things at a time. That's it. This is a fundamental limitation of the human brain. The average teenager now believes they can follow 7 forms of media at the same time. So what happens is scientists like Professor Miller, scientists all over the world, including in Korea, get people into labs and get them to think they're doing more than one thing at a time, and then they monitor them. And what they discover is always the same. You can't do more than one thing at a time, but what you do is you juggle very rapidly between tasks. You're like, what did you just ask me? What is this message on WhatsApp? What does it say on the TV over there? What is this message on Facebook? Wait, sorry, what did you ask me again? And it turns out that juggling comes with a really big cost. The technical term for it is the switch cost effect, one of the most important terms people can learn, the switch cost effect.
여기서 하나의 과학적인 용어가 나오는데 스위칭 코스트라는 단어가 나와요. 이 일을 하다가 저 일을 하거나 일을 바꾸잖아요. 그럼 일을 바꿀 때마다 조금씩 스트레스가 쌓인다는 겁니다. 인간은 멀티태스킹이 불가능한 동물이다. 삶의 질은 저하시키고 생산성 역시 떨어뜨리는 안 좋은 패턴에 우리가 빠져 있다는 거죠.
Hewlett-Packard, the printer company, got a scientist in to study their workers and he split them into 2 groups. And the first group was told, just get on with your task, whatever it is, and you're not going to be interrupted. And the second group was told, get on with your task, whatever it is. At the same time, though, you've got to answer a heavy load of email and phone calls. So pretty much how most of us live. And at the end of it, the scientist involved, Dr. Glenn Wilson, tested the IQs of both groups. The group that had not been interrupted scored, on average, 10 IQ points higher than the group that had. To give you a sense of how big an effect that is, if you or me smoked cannabis together now and got stoned, our IQs would go down in the short term by 5 points. So being chronically interrupted is twice as bad for your intelligence in the short term as getting stoned. But you can see how big an effect this is, right?
또 얼마 전에 제가 이제 장동성 박사님이랑 한 컨텐츠에서 장동성 박사님이 한 얘기가 있어요. 테크놀로지 때문에 아이들이 산만하다고 하지만 게임이나 넷플릭스 같은 데 몰입하는 걸 보면은 사실 몰입이 온라인 공간에서 이루어지고 있다. 하리 씨는 어떻게 생각하느냐라고 물어봤습니다.
The technical term for it is negativity bias. Basically, you will stare longer at something that makes you angry and upset than you will at something that makes you feel good. If you've ever seen a car crash on the highway, you know what I mean. You stared longer at the car wreck than you did at the pretty flowers on the other side of the street, right?
Closer to our profession is when we see 90 good book reviews, we forget about them and we see one bad one. And you stay up at night wanting to respond to that person, you know, saying that that's not what I meant.
I completely agree. This has always been part of us. But when it combines with algorithms that learn who you are and what makes you specifically angry, it has a terrible effect. Mm-hmm. So picture 2 teenage girls who go to the same party and go home on the same bus. They both open their phones and do TikTok videos. And one of them says, that was such a great party last night. We danced to Ariana Grande, loved it. What fun. And the other one opens their phone and goes, Karen was an absolute skank at that party and her boyfriend's an asshole, and just does an angry rant about everyone at the party. Mm-hmm. The algorithms are constantly scanning the kind of words you use. And they'll put the first video into a few people's feeds, but it'll put the second video into far more people's feeds. Because if it's enraging, it's engaging. And what do you mean Karen's a skank? You're a skank. It's going to cause a fight. You're going to come back. You keep arguing. More and more people get drawn in. So we can talk about they're sharing lovely videos about flipping water bottles, which I agree, love it. But the algorithm will mix that with increasingly negative and hostile videos because you are more likely to keep scrolling if you see angry and hostile videos. In fact, Professor Jean Twenge in San Diego has shown in the United States, the average teenage girl now has the same level of anxiety that the average teenager admitted to a psychiatric hospital had in the 1950s, right? So we've got very high levels of anxiety.
현대 사회와 옛날 사회를 비교를 했을 때 인간이 가지고 있는 네거티브 바이어스라는 게 있대요. 다시 말하면 우리는 좋은 뉴스보다 나쁜 뉴스, 칭찬보다는 욕에 훨씬 더 민감하게 반응을 한다는 겁니다. 그러다 보니까 인터넷 알고리즘 자체가 좋은 소식보다는 나쁜 소식을 더 많이 증폭시켜서 우리한테 배달을 할 수밖에 없고 그게 클릭률도 높고 사람들이 더 반응을 격하게 하니까 그렇기 때문에 우리 사회가 마치 곧 망할 것 같은 착각에 사로잡혀 살 수도 있다는 거죠.
In fact, they discovered that a third of all the people who had joined neo-Nazi groups in Germany had joined because the Facebook algorithm specifically recommended it. You might want to join, it said, followed by a neo-Nazi group.
제가 가장 한국인으로서 공감이 됐던 얘기는 교육 얘기예요. 어렸을 때부터 나한테 이게 의미가 있네 라고 하는 일을 찾아서 그거에 빠지는 습관이 돼야 되는데 점점 암기식, 대학 입시 위주식으로 바뀌게 되면서 어떤 거에 관심을 가지고 몰두하는 훈련 자체가 사라지고 있다고 얘기를 하면서 지금 미국과 영국의 교육이 가는 방향을 굉장히 신랄하게 비판을 했습니다.
Is attention evolved to attach to meaning? A frog can pay really good attention to a fly and it doesn't pay very much attention to a stone because a fly is really meaningful to a frog. That's dinner, right? The stone, who cares? It's nothing to me, right? Schools that are about finding out what kids find interesting and infusing learning with meaning produce kids who can pay much better attention. So I spent a lot of time going to progressive schools for the book to see this in practice. For example, I went to a school in Berlin called the Evangelische Schule Zentrum, which has this fascinating model. So they start every school year by getting the kids to talk about something they find interesting. So when I was there, they'd come up with the question, could human beings ever live on the moon? It's an elementary school, they're young kids, right? And then half of all the lessons they do are exploring this from different questions. So they learn the history of people going to the moon and going to space. They learn the math of how do rockets get to the moon? How would you build? They learn the science of how do you bring oxygen to the moon? And because it's a question they wanted to answer, they're so much more plugged in to exploring it. You can see their excitement and they start coming up with other elements they want to explore, right? The difference between that and what I got at school.
I imagine you got one of these back in the days.
The thing is, now as an adult, Latin would be really interesting to me, right? I'd love to be able to read loads of ancient Roman text. That's because I want now to understand it. I think about the disgrace of the fact that I was taught languages at school. I spent 7 years learning those languages and I could not speak a damn word of them now because I was forced to do it and I didn't care. School systems infused with meaning produce kids who are much better able to focus. The
problems that you point out is especially pronounced in Korea.
It's interesting speaking to you and hearing what you're saying maybe it helps me to understand why the Korean edition is the best-selling non-English language edition of the book.
이분이 말씀하신 영어권보다 우리나라가 더 심하다라고 생각했던 게 일과 삶의 관계가 점점 흐려지는 부분이에요. 우리가 이제 업무 시간을 정해놓고 그 시간을 채워야 월급을 받기 때문에 지금의 직장 체계가 몰두를 한 사람한테 리워드를 주는 게 아니라 시간이 오래 걸린 사람한테 리워드를 주는 방식으로 발달되어 있기 때문에 사람들이 몰두한 능력을 잃어버리고 있고 우리가 가지고 있는 생산력이라는 거에 대한 잘못된 개념으로부터 만들어졌는지까지 설명을 해주셨어요.
What it makes you realize, and I think Korea is very acutely, but this is also true in Britain, the United States, many places, is how we've ended up with a profoundly wrong conception of what productivity is. So at some level, we all know this because there's no one watching who would want the Korean soccer team to walk onto the match having had 5 hours sleep the night before, really stressed out and anxious, and with their phone in their hand to answer text messages that might come in during the game. No one would want that, right? We all know the team would definitely lose if you did that, right? And we have to then apply that principle to ourselves, right? If it doesn't make your soccer team productive, it also doesn't make you productive. So there's a guy called Andrew Barnes. You should also have him on your podcast. I'll introduce you. He's a great person. One day he was on a plane and he read a study that really shocked him in The Economist or something like that, that found that the average office worker was actually only focusing on their job 3 hours a day. So they're sitting at their desk for 8 hours a day, but they're actually only really focusing for 3 hours. And I thought, wow, this is a really bad deal for everyone. It's a bad deal for the worker. They're not doing the things they want to do. And it's a bad deal for the employer because, you know, you're paying people for 8 hours and you're only getting 3. So he decided to do an experiment. He figured if I gave people an extra day off every week, so they only worked for 4 days a week, but I paid them the same as I currently pay them to work 5 days. If in return, they were just 40 minutes more productive, if these figures applied to his company, they were just 45 minutes more productive, then that would make up for the extra day, right? And what they discovered seems at first really odd. The company achieved more in 4 days than they had in 5, right? And this is something that's been found everywhere where they tried a 4-day week. They tried it in Toyota in Japan. They had a 40% increase in productivity. And again, it seems counterintuitive until you realize exhausted, worn out people are not productive.
얼마 전에 제가 퍼트넘 교수의 그 EBS 강의를 봤는데 거기서 소셜 캐피탈이라는 얘기를 하더라고요. 민주주의가 성공을 하기 위해서는 사람들이 합창단이라든지 동네 축구단처럼 많은 사람들이 협력을 하는 경험을 가진 커뮤니티에서만 민주주의가 제대로 정착을 하고 꽃피웠다라는 얘기를 하는데요. 인터넷이 우리가 타인에게 집중할 수 있는 시간을 뺏어가고 불안감을 높여서 주변 사람들한테 공격적으로 행동하게 하거나 그 사람들에 대한 신뢰를 깨트리기 때문에 민주주의가 점점 옛날에 비해서 잘 안 돌아가고 있다라는 얘기는 한 15년 전부터 계속 나왔는데 이런 것이 앞으로 점점 더 가속될 수 있다라고 얘기를 합니다.
Let's look at Facebook's own internal research, which was leaked by a heroic whistleblower, Frances Haugen. In the wake of the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote in my own country, which has had a catastrophic effect on the British economy, in the aftermath of that, Facebook set up a group of its own data scientists to figure out, well, did we play a role in promoting this rage, right? And what their own data scientists found is that Facebook's algorithm was inherently promoting hatred and division. It's not a coincidence that our individual attention is collapsing at the same time as our collective attention, right? The factors that are assaulting individual attention are profoundly harming collective attention. And democracy is a form of deep attention, right? It requires a citizenry that can pay attention, that can think deeply, that can distinguish truth from lies, can sustain pressure on politicians until they do the things they need to do. A society of people that can't do that can't be a democracy. The entire internet has existed for less than 10,000 days. Many of these changes that we're talking about are very recent, right? Lots of people watching can remember the world before many of these changes, right? We can fix this stuff if we want to, but it won't fix itself, right? Yes, of course, we want a life with lots of technology, but we also want a life where we can think deeply, where we can read books, where our children can play outside. If we want that, we can get it, right? The evidence is very clear about how to get there. I've seen it being put into practice all over the world, but it requires a shift in psychology. We need to stop blaming ourselves and start blaming the factors that are doing this to us and taking them on, because we're not medieval peasants begging at the court of King Zuckerberg and King Musk for a few little crumbs of attention from their table. We are the free citizens of democracies, extremely hard-won democracies in the case of South Korea. And we own our own minds. And together we can take them back if we want to.
하리 작가님의 접근이 흥미로웠던 건 뭐냐면은 인간은 분위기의 동물이라는 거죠. 그러니까 예를 들어서 어느 도시에 사느냐에 따라서 사람의 비만도가 다르다는 얘기를 해요. 도시 자체가 걷는 도시로 디자인되어 있으면은 그 도시에는 홀쭉한 사람이 많고, 뭔가 걷기보다는 차를 타야 조금 더 편하게 다닐 수 있는 방식으로 디자인이 되면은 그 도시에는 비만이 늘어날 수밖에 없다. 사람들의 두뇌도 똑같지 않을까? 진짜 중대한 문제, 내가 하고 싶은 성취에 오랫동안 내가 몰두할 수 있는 그런 세상을 만들려면은 어떻게 해야 되는지 고민해야 되는 가장 큰 문제고, 저도 거기에 어느 정도 동의하는 바가 있어서 오늘 이 책을 추천했습니다. 오늘 조선의 탐구생활은 여기서 마무리하고요. 다음번에는 더 재밌는 문화 역사 이야기로 여러분 찾아뵙겠습니다. 그리고 일론 머스크를 2년 동안 직접 따라다니면서 관찰한 내용을 바탕으로 쓴 일론 머스크 전기의 작가 월터 아이작슨과의 인터뷰도 기대해주세요. 감사합니다. 안녕히 계십시오.